distinguished guest. It's really a pleasure also to have a distinguished guest like Jennifer Robinson with us from UCL in London. And I don't know if, well, probably many of you know already the Hot of the Press presentations. During COVID, we went online and we kept this format because it allowed a lot of people from all over the world to connect. While it was in Vienna, it was just the Viennese people who could enjoy of this opportunity. So we are hosting today Jennifer Robinson from UCL, presenting her very recently published book on comparative urbanism, Tactics for Global Urban Studies, published by Wiley-Blackwell, Oxford, by the end, I guess, of 2022. It has been a long process to get it published, and a lot of people know about this book already since a few years, and many contributions by Jenny, also editing a special issue on comparative urban studies for IJUR and other activities going on. Probably Jenny doesn't need a very formal introduction because most of you know her, but I will in any case just say a few words. We know each other already quite some years, actually. I guess we met last time in Amsterdam at Sacco Muster's retirement, indeed, and it was always a pleasure. So Jennifer is a professor of human geography at UCL London, where she also co-directs the urban laboratory. Previously, she has worked, I hope I pronounce it right, KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, in Durban. Were you in Durban or in one other locations?
No, in Durban, yeah.
In Durban, yes, where we went actually quite some years ago for a World Congress of Sociology.
Exactly.
And she published a very famous book, Ordinary Cities. And since then, she developed the post-colonial, well, even before, but since then it became quite a very important voice and presence in the development of a post-colonial critique of urban studies. And she also started to develop an increasing, as she writes also in her foreword or preface, all people asked her, how do you operationalize that? And this book is actually an attempt to answer this question in a quite thorough way. And we are very, very keen to hear what you have to present. She has done a lot of empirical studies as well about the comparative gesture in a way. And she recently got also awarded a near-sea project about African cities in collaboration with a few African colleagues, and which is quite a big achievement in Europe, and I would say worldwide. And we are very happy to hear your presentation. Before that, I will very quickly also present the two discussants. So Julie Wren, who is a senior scientist at the Department of Geography of the University of Zurich, where she is also the group leader of urban studies. She holds a PhD at Humboldt University in Berlin and had postdoc assignments in Hong Kong and LSE. And she also works on comparative urbanism. So we thought it would be a perfect person to be here discussing Jenny's book. The other person and colleague and friend is Tauri Tuvikene from the University of Tallinn in Estonia, where he's working as a professor for urban studies at the School of Humanities and Tallinn University, indeed. And also his research is about comparative urban studies and comparative urbanism, but from a slightly different perspective, involving post-socialist countries and also mobility. Both, or actually all three, have published extensively on the issue and are already since a long time in a conversation together, but we thought it would be a nice idea to have them here discussing for us and with us about Jenny's contribution. So I'll stop here. The format will be half an hour, 40 minutes presentation by Jenny Robinson. Then we will have a first round of comments by the discussants. Jenny Robinson then will answer the comments and the solicitations, the questions. And then we open up the audience for comments, questions from everybody involved around here. We have already 90 participants from all over the world, actually, I would say from many different time zones. So you are all welcome, and it's a real pleasure to have you all here. Jenny, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Yuri, and thanks to Brice for making the format accessible. And I'm so pleased that Julie and Tauri have agreed to offer comments. It's really a very special moment when your book sees the light of day and other people read it and make some comments on it. It makes it feel very alive. So I'm really very grateful for the opportunity. So I'll just share a sort of overview of the book and what it tries to achieve. So starting perhaps with the cover image, which is from a wonderful Angolan sculptor and artist, Antonio Ole, who put together the sculpture, which brings, in the way that the vernacular constructions of informal housing and sub-Saharan Africa do, bring together many different elements of what is found in cities to compose this image or this wall in a township in informal or formal popular area in Southern Africa, one way to describe it. So for me, this stands for where the book ends up. And it's quite a long book. And it ends up in a chapter 11, so quite a few chapters, which for me is the heart of what I hope to liberate in a way in urban studies, which is the process of conceptualizing the urban as something that is emergent, that can be multiple, can be a multiplicity of concepts, and that each concept itself is formed out of the multiplicity of what the urban is. So in the way, in a sense, that this wall perhaps produces a sense of the city, produces a part of the city. As we work, our concepts emerge from our many, many observations. And it's each of those observations that, following Deleuze, I would call a singularity, an instant moment in our composing a concept. So that's where the book heads towards. And in a way, it was where I wanted to begin, which was with the possibility of a revisable concepts of the urban, so that what we inherit or the concepts we learn in our fields, in the canon, are perhaps useful, perhaps resonant, but actually we can liberate ourselves to produce new concepts of the urban from wherever. And I guess if the global urban studies is a project, a decolonial project of refusing the inherited concepts that are largely parochialized as American and European, how can we open ourselves to producing concepts from anywhere? So that's the main driver of the book. And Yuri hinted at why I wrote this book. It took quite some time, some interruptions, the usual things, a child, a new job, a whole program of teaching activity and other things. So between Ordinary Cities and Comparative Urbanism, so some 17 years, I think. So, which is exactly how old my son is. So Ordinary Cities arrives at a moment when I felt very compelled, along with a number of others, about the inheritance, the canon of urban studies, compelled to deconstruct it, to critique it, to locate it in its origins, and to insist that it didn't necessarily fit the concerns and interests and ways of all cities, and many cities in poorer contexts, what some would call the global south, or across the global east, former socialist context, which Tauri particularly talks about. So out of this then arose the desire to find some practical ways to convince other people that this was possible, because in fact, when I published the Ordinary Cities book, people found it a ridiculous idea that you would compose a theory of the urban around informality or around other places, and really genuinely had people in job interview panels looking shocked and horrified. So we've moved a long way. And this book really tries to bring together so many of the experiments and suggestions that different scholars have been making through the theme or rubric of comparison. It's not something that relies on any traditional idea of comparison. It uses some of the key tropes of comparison as an inspiration. So in fact, the book starts with a critique of inherited comparative urban studies as being very limited, restricting what kinds of cities we can compare, restricting ourselves to comparing cities as territories, rather than looking at urbanization as a complex process stretching across the borders and boundaries of what we might think of as cities. So we take some inspiration from comparison, largely because it's an initiative which you're always invited to think with elsewhere, with some other place. And urban studies is a certain genre in which we have little choice, but if we say the word urban, we're not talking about one phenomenon or something that's the same everywhere, but we always have to glance the gesture that Yuri talked about, the comparative gesture. Somewhere else is and different, and maybe so in such a way we can learn from that. So what I take mostly from the comparative method is the desire to think again about what we know about one place through thinking another place, to open ourselves up to theoretical change. And that I found to be the most liberating thing. So this book sits in a whole series of debates which really have proliferated in the last decade and which are so productive. The first chapter of the book looks a little bit at each of these approaches and thinks about how they contribute to reformulating global urban studies and how they might be supported by a comparative imagination. So people are promoting ideas of thinking from specific regions or thinking from the more baggy geopolitical category of the global south, which takes us so far perhaps in the sight of critiquing from what has been exteriorized, but both regions and the global south are quickly disaggregated and punctuated by wider processes. We're very challenged by ideas about the disappearing city, that in fact the urban has become generalized, arguably to be found in possibly in any place around the world in a planetary sense, not that it is everywhere, but that we need to explore the processes of urbanization all over the place. We've had a very powerful set of critiques, more familiar to me in feminist and decolonial critiques, arguing for different forms of knowledge production by a diversity of voices and bodies, and by insistence that thinking from those places that have been excluded from knowledge is really important. And finally, a sensibility to the materialities of social life has been really important, certainly in geography, that thinking from the almost brute material form of urban life is something that perhaps sets a limit to the possibility of conceptualization, as might the suggestion that as a result, each place is completely distinctive. Can we therefore not conceptualize at all? And I think this is the arc that takes us through to the final chapter of the book, in which, in fact, these moments when we stumble, as Walter Benjamin's poet did, stumble on the cobblestones of the city, we find that moment to be perhaps the most generative and inspiring moment to build concepts, to think again about the city. So my suggestion is that across many of the different movements within urban studies right now, we share a project around trying to find new ways to think the global urban, for concepts to be highly revisable, to be able to start thinking the urban anywhere, privileged sites of urbanity, to work across very different kinds of urban outcomes, to sustain a conversation. So I do think, for me, that conversation about the urban remains an important feature. To think with a multidimensional and very complex spatial form. So where the city is unclear. We're not comparing cities, we're comparing perhaps territorial outcomes of very extensive urbanization processes. How would we compose comparisons around that? And one of the chapters, I think chapter 10 addresses this question. What territories, what places, how do we bring different places into the conversation? And what I do through the book is try to be really very open to learning from many different perspectives and to suggest what does comparison look like from each of those theoretical perspectives. And in a way, each of the perspectives that we could think of, whether this is Marxism committed to a concrete form of theorization, Weberian approaches committed to some kind of ideal image or concept, these are all carrying a certain weight of the material. None of the approaches suggest there's no presence of the material city, no presence of the physical experienced world. They formulate these in different ways, but in all theorizations, there's a demand to respond to an emergent materiality of the urban world and different ways of formulating how we would do that, leading to different possibilities for building understandings, building concepts, and for trying to develop new ideas and understandings of the urban. And the final thing that is really important for me, and it perhaps turns in a way that may feel a bit unfamiliar, and that is to decenter the subject of theorization. Quite often this comes through in sort of quite self-reflexive anxieties of Northern scholars about how are they relating to subaltern actors in other parts of the world, how are they traveling around with their ideas. Actually, I just want to dispense with the centering of such a subject and rather to think about what does it mean to insist on composing theorizations from anywhere, and who that subject is not looking the same as the traveling Northern subject. And so from any context, ideas are arriving, ideas are reformulated, ideas are generated and produced. And so understanding the urban, the problematic of understanding the urban globally is a very different one, I think, from that decentered position, which is for me a long-standing inspiration from post-colonial feminism. So this is where I began really writing in about 2011, trying to understand what it would mean to work with comparative urban studies. And quite quickly, I realized that we have to reformat comparison, that as it stands in urban studies, it's very limited. And so the book works with this very loose sense of what comparison means. So a very broad practice of thinking the urban through or with elsewhere, another case, a wider context, the existing theoretical imaginations that come from other places through connections to other places becomes very important to contribute to broader conceptualizations and conversations about aspects of urban life. So very quickly, it became clear to me that the imagination of formal comparative methods didn't really take into account the actual spatiality of the urban. Urban places are made through multiple overlapping connections, and the urban is the fullness of the spaces that are produced as urban. And so thinking across many different dimensions, starting with that rich spatiality, becomes an important guide to how we might imagine ourselves thinking and talking across different contexts. And then I was very intrigued by the title of Gilles Deleuze's book, Difference in Repetition, and a decade later was able to perhaps bring together some thoughts from there around working with the way in which the urban is always produced very often through connections, through multiple things coming together, and that it's this genetic emergence of the urban world which can really guide us to think about what the urban is. But it's also, and this was the thing about Deleuze I was very surprised about as a geographer, reading a lot of geographers using Deleuze, I was very surprised that actually this book is a theorization of conceptualization. How do we, as subjects, facing this emergent urban world, produce ideas, produce insights? So with both these virtual series then, the virtual series of all the possibilities the urban could be, and all the possible things we could think with that are available to us to think with, in the intersection emerges concepts. And so I took this as a trope, an organizing trope for the book, that we could think about perhaps two different kinds of grounds for comparison. The one being genetic, in a way, the emergent prolific connections which constitute the urban world, and the other, which raises a whole series of interesting questions, that is, it's us as subjects of research who are composing comparisons, motivated for whatever reason, and that needs interrogation, bound up with power relations, our institutions, our ways of publishing, and so on. But it's a generative process of thinking what makes a sensible way of approaching, trying to understand problems across a diverse urban world. And I think here, this generative process, Julie Wren's own book on engaging comparative urbanism, asks us to think about that. She calls it defining a theoretical case. What is it that drives us to work across different contexts? So that would be one example of what I was thinking of as generative. Although, Julie, I think your book also traces particular links and connections between art practice in different places. So in a way, it's a wonderful example of bringing together those two kinds of practices for me. But you perhaps define your project in another way. We'll hear about that. So this leads me to then scope out, inspired very much by the work of different authors, to scope out some specific tactics. So things, hoping that this might be helpful to bring them together for people who imagining to design a research project or trying to formulate how they've been thinking across different places, and also to inspire us to learn from scholars in different contexts and to work with scholars in different contexts, to generate knowledge that is more collaborative and collective. So the kinds of two kinds of tactics then: tracing connections as a form of genetic comparison, which helps us to identify urbanization processes, which are perhaps involved in, say, policy mobilities and the forming connections between places. So something like neoliberalization could well be such a thing, tracking its progress and movement of ideas and practices. We come perhaps to identify then repeated instances of certain phenomena tracking across different urban contexts. And here Jane Jacobs' work, a couple of papers around this theme, lead us to be very intrigued by how looking at repeated instances of interconnected phenomena might lead us to see different examples adding up to an understanding of something that seems to be a wider phenomenon. And for her, it was a residential high-rise. We see emerging the repeated instance of the residential high-rise. And out of that, we can form an empirically additive understanding of something which we might conceptualize as, say, modernist architecture. It's not, so she opposes the idea that it's modernist architecture that's moving around as such, but in tracing the specific connections, material flows, and ideas that generate each instance of a high-rise building, we might compose a concept through that empirically additive process. At the same time, if we see repeated examples of something flowing around the world, it might ask us to take away from a big idea. Each one would be different. Each time the concept or the process we're looking at would be depleted, in fact, less relevant as a term. And I think by tracing connections and looking at specific empirical flows between cities, we quickly come to the idea that every case matters, every case is distinctive. And this inspires us perhaps look back at the other case with a new perspective, with different insights. So starting elsewhere, starting in unexpected contexts leads every case to matter theoretically. So this is to trace specific material processes, perhaps, or specific movements of ideas, or specific aspects of the urban moving around. And then there's a more political economy perspective. So that earlier one is more materialities perspective. Within a more political economy perspective, we would perhaps use comparison to interrogate what we very loosely in social science often call wider processes. What are those? It's a good question. So state formation, for example, neoliberalization, financialization, these are things that we think are wider processes which kind of hit the ground and are hybridized in contexts. And so looking across many cases can help us to interrogate those. Thinking from the context themselves within this perspective, where many processes arrive, opens our minds to the variety of processes that are shaping outcomes, and perhaps to interrogate the hybridization and relevance of the overarching concepts that arrive there. I'll look at a quick example in a minute of neoliberalization, which is well researched. And then generating concepts is really intriguing strategy in a way composing comparisons with features that are shared across urban contexts. One thing that I found very interesting, and chapter 3 of the book looks at this, is that in the old-fashioned version of comparison, we had to work really hard to say, these 4 cities are comparable because they're sitting in the same country, they have similar policy context, they're similar size or whatever. So you really try and define something down to very similar processes, and then looking for variation in those processes through the comparison. What I identified is that often when it comes to thinking about, to theorizing on the basis of the identified variations, people jump in with new terms, new features that are shared across the context. So for example, I discussed a great paper from Susan Clark in about 94, in which she did this very good comparative exercise, try and find 8 very comparable cities in the US. But then she jumped in with new concepts to say, okay, well, look, these places have got very democratic processes of policy formulation on economic development, and these processes are subcontracting and creating standalone for-profit entities. So they have different outcomes. So it seemed to me that actually the comparison was turning on these shared features, which were coming in quite late in the day on the basis of theoretical perspectives. And my question from the parts of the world that I sit in is, well, why don't we just start with those shared features in the first place and look at the great variety of them that we find? So start with, for example, forms of urban democracy. And there'll be many, many different forms, ways in which political leaders are influenced and shaped, including to highly informalized processes, perhaps highly corrupt processes, and so on. So bringing in the range of urban experiences. And a recent, Yuri mentioned some of the empirical work that we've been doing, and in our recent paper in Urban Studies, drawing on research with Fulong Wu and Phil Harrison, looking at Shanghai, London, and Johannesburg, we in fact took this approach. We took 3 territories with politics around large-scale urban development and tried to look at the variety, the great variety of forms of politics that are driving urban development, rather than assuming what that politics is. Say, large-scale developments are associated with neoliberalization. Actually, that wasn't correct. And taking a different starting point allowed us to see different kinds of political processes. So starting with shared features like large-scale developments, which are almost ubiquitous in cities, opens us up to thinking with that variety. And then that inspires us perhaps to start with specific territories. What is going on in this territory? And how do we think about those processes in relation to perhaps similarly located territories, spatial in terms of spatial relationships, or very different kinds of urban territories, or ones that are shaped by similar processes. So starting with the specificity of territories seemed to me to be a really important maneuver, and then opening up to the multiplicity of what is going on in those territories, even more than contexts. And that drives one also to the materialities, to trace and track and think about elsewhere through the physicality of territories. A good example here was the Global Suburbanism project, which Roger Kyle and others were involved in, where the territory of the periphery of cities was opened up across great diversity to re-explore what it is that suburb could be, the thing that's on the edges of the urban across many different contexts. And here then a real globalization and evacuation of the American meaning of the term, a globalization of a new content, a new configuration. So that was one kind of strategy. And then in the very loosest form, generating concepts can happen in a very exploratory way, opening up concepts across difference and seeing what it is that one can learn across the greatest divergence. So what I head towards in the book is towards thinking about concepts as emerging across many different observations through all these different kinds of methods, that ideas might emerge across diverse urban experiences and generate new insights. And I go through the idea of informality as a term that has captured the exception of the urban. Has been very much a catch-all category for everything that's initially seemed to be not urban. And informality has accumulated meaning as governance, as experience, as associational phenomena, as housing, shelter, whatever. Many kinds of things about urbanization are described as informal. And actually the literature on informality has put its finger on really what is a very core urban feature, which is the fact that urban phenomena are emergent from many different processes coming together unpredictably so. In this case, then, what was the marker of exception, informality, becomes a really core definer of the urban as such, but it also gets to lose its meaning in a way because it's become so extended. And so many of the things that were thought of through the rubric of informality become definable in a new kind of way. So, for example, we might think not about informality as emergent relationships about managing certain kinds of phenomena in cities, but about specific forms of governance. And I think this is where Tauri and his colleagues wrote a really excellent paper some time ago now about how we can think about the state through what has been set aside as informality, but through things like legal voids or negotiated outcomes. And so the term informality, which was, this exceptionalizing term for third world, African urbanization, poor cities and everything, gets dispersed in a new realignment of observations. And this, I like the metaphor of Walter Benjamin around constellations. So I'll just quickly show you a few slides that bring together that storyline of the book. So looking at connections and relations as framing how we might compose comparisons across different places. And the images from the book show, for example, the statue in Johannesburg of the Firewalker by William Kentridge, which in the left-hand image shows the copper wire being dug up for sale from Johannesburg and the traffic lights therefore not working. The reason being that the commodities demand of Asia, China especially, led to theft in the sale of that. At the moment, South Africa's lights are out because the cabal around the Minister of Energy, in fact, is selling off South Africa's coal to China instead of putting it into the power stations. So the connection of different places can be very material and very immediate. The cars come to a stop in Joburg because Beijing is paying high prices for copper wire. So we then see another example of the Firewalker restaged in Johannesburg, in London there. So a very specific track and connection, which makes you ask questions across the different contexts. So many times in the city, the sort of differentiation of mobility produces inspires us to think comparatively. So in terms of the connections, I'm trying to hint at two different kinds of styles. The one which is associated perhaps with specific movements, mobilities, more material, leads to repeated instances and attention to the real, what we colloquially in social science call singularities or specific outcomes, which then invite us to think in the ways I explained, drawing on Jane Jacobs' work, for example, questioning existing theories, using the repeated instances to add up to an understanding of a process. So tracking the genesis of urban phenomena, tracing specific interconnections. And then the other is in a more political economy vein, where we start with Jill Hart's idea about relational places or contexts as a multiplicity of intersecting processes. And these can help us to illuminate wider processes and to offer perhaps new theorizations of those. Here, in terms of the repeated instances and interconnections, so what I try to do in the book is to come down to some specific things that you can do. So this comes from chapter 5. So you can really track specific movement of things across places. What do you get if you do that? You can identify wider urbanization processes, such as what Peck and Theodore call rule regimes, or looking at distended cases as things move about. But if we look at connections producing repeated instances, then it can be helpful to see, well, what is the instance? What is the thing we want to think about? What comes into view? A high-rise building, a pavement, a starchitect phenomena, certain kinds of large-scale developments. So the repeated instance, we can see what is the thing to think with if we track flows and connections. And then, as I suggested, we can be empirically additive, thinking about some emergent phenomena we can see many of, or subtract from what we identify, or simply thicken the singularity, identify that every case matters. The example that I promised around neoliberalization, so this is working in a very political economy vein, and we have really a very well-worked theme of research here. So it's a case I develop in quite some detail in chapter 6. So we have this wonderful work from Brenner, Peck, and Theodore, which gives us a great account of how urbanization is embedded in neoliberalization's transformation, progress, emergence around the world, and some familiar terms there. What can comparison do about that? Well, we can look at many cases and strengthen that understanding. We find lots of cases that help to reinforce that approach. We could look at cases where actually in the hybridization that they talk about, what becomes quite clear, the contingent aspects or explanations for what's happening, why it's different in the different cases. And we start to look more closely perhaps at those contingent elements. Cases could also, going in that direction, help to identify some alternative processes that are relevant, that would be important to think about, and not just neoliberalization as a concept, but other kinds of concepts come into view if we're looking comparatively. We're drawn to notice that. And at the end of the day, we might say, well, we've got such divergent cases, and actually, perhaps we should start again with our conceptual analysis and forget about neoliberalization as a starting point. But one of those contingent processes becomes really the important analytic. And I guess that was, in a way, the move that Sue Parnell and other people like James Ferguson, Sue and I wrote a paper about this in about 2012, so ages ago, that we might well talk about developmentalism as neoliberalization in many urban contexts. And then it may be that we come to a set of cases where the process we start with is really tangential, it's incoherent, its different elements don't add up to a concept, it becomes very fragmented. In that case, new concepts might be emergent as we take different elements and bring them together in a different kind of formation. And along the way, I make a critique of the idea that family resemblance is a way to hold together the concept of neoliberalism, because the family resemblance idea from Wittgenstein suggests that you have overlapping phenomena which don't have all their elements in common, some things in common, some things are different, but still they kind of belong together. But the opening of that formulation is that you could recombine the elements that you are calling one concept into a new concept. And that's very much a part of the process. So family resemblance opens to transformation of concepts, doesn't keep them closed down. When we come to composing comparisons, there's such a lot of creative things that urban scholars might do. And one of the things that is the turning point, if you like, in the chapter that discusses this, which is chapter 8, is Lefebvre's comment here that the city's transformations are not the passive outcomes of changes in the social whole. So this chapter kind of moves from a sort of context conjuncture analysis in which the city is a kind of territorial outcome of wider social processes and things all coming together, to taking seriously the Lefebvrean problematic of the urban as the fullness of experience of space, the multiplicity of processes producing the urban. And that it's, if we're going to build an urban comparison, perhaps that's a good basis to build it from. So one of the points that occurred to me as I was preparing that chapter is that how we can compose a comparison and what we think we're going to achieve with that comparison depends very much on how we think of the urban world, how we theorize what it is. So if the urban world is a certain emergent conjuncture from different historical formations, plus a kind of strong scalar imagination, which comes through especially in Jamie Peck's work, that's a very productive way to compose comparisons within a certain delimited political economic setting, which could be a nation, a region, could be global, which Jill Hart is trying to argue for, thinking about a global conjuncture in which we can compare, say, the emergence of Indian or American conservative nationalism. But often the conjuncture limits what we can bring together. So although it draws us to pan-urban processes, thinking about a certain emergent political economic conjuncture can define a world in which we're thinking, which doesn't lead us to perhaps look to another case, a very different case. So if we're looking, for example, at financial austerity and disciplinary governance, where could you look from America to learn about that? But very helpfully, perhaps, to the 1980 structural adjustment policies, which ran through Africa and South America. But a conjunctural imagination doesn't lead you to that comparison. Otherwise, we can think about the urban as a specific place, as a concrete totality, as a fullness of what is, in which case we really have a big set of openings to think across diverse cases. But we also potentially could look at how the processes that we want to analyze, the concepts and terms we want to think about as shaping the urban, are emergent in different empirical contexts. And here, the work of Christian Schmid and his team in an urban studies paper from 2018 defines the urbanization process as really an empirically defined generalization, which can help us to understand shared aspects of urbanization in different places on that basis of starting from the concrete totality of whatever the urban is. And then for me, I'm very inclined to go in the direction of a great deal of diversity, diverse kinds of urban territories, fantastic variety of phenomena shaping the urban and characterizing urban outcomes. So that's where that sort of thing ends up. And then the book also has a long chapter 7, which thinks about who is generating these concepts. And this is such an important question, because otherwise it just seems like this is all fine, you know. Everyone just generates some concept without thinking about their positionality, what kind of questions they're asking, what are the power relations of that, what is the formulation, the theoretical formulations that lie behind the possibility of speaking the terms that they are discussing. And so I go through a range of different questions, very inspired by feminist and Black studies scholars, but also turning surprisingly perhaps to Max Weber and ideal types as experimental, emergent, but historically and empirically located possibilities for thinking about phenomena. And I offer some critiques of some Marxist theoretical claims to privileged access to the empirical through the term of the concrete, and work through some of Stuart Hall's work there, and end up with, inspired by my dear colleague Clive Barnett, who sadly passed away just over a year ago now, inspired by Hannah Arendt and others, including Achille Mbembe, working on African contexts and literature, to think about the emergent horizon of conceptualization, which is a collective project, something we perhaps build in common, but which is always contested. And from this, I'm open to the idea that concepts are emergent from the multiplicity of our observations as a multiplicity, because no one concept should or need to gain huge weight in our theorization. And this is where the end of the book, where I began, opens to really confronting the territory, the urban, as its kind of almost unformed brute materiality, and as very specific and distinctive. Each urban outcome, each urban territory is very distinctive. What does it mean to think from those contexts? And I can just, I'm almost concluding here. So Bryce, I see you getting concerned. Thinking here, if we jump into the territory, do we find no words? Do we find no concepts? But in fact, in jumping into that territory, I found an amazing problematic defined partly by Deleuze's philosophy, partly by some of the writing of Walter Benjamin on cities. So that comes through in chapter 11 as well. So out of this moment, the abyss of not knowing or not being able to name something, of not being able to link our concepts and phenomena, out of that emerges the possibility of ideas, of insights, of concepts. And sort of two quite different responses by scholars to that problematic. Malik Simone, in his wonderful 2019 text, Improvised Lives, suggests that actually the world is not asking us to compare it. It's not asking us to understand it. So differences are turned away from each other. The world is somewhat detached, incomparable. We as scholars are never up to date, always running behind stuff. So actually, this is a very different mode of comparison, of conceptualization, or not from him. But from Philippe de Buc's work, he calls on his observations and conversations with people in Kinshasa, where he says people are searching for ways to understand this complexity that they are experiencing, looking, for example, for ways to bring into speech, into conversation, into rumor, the nature of the urban world. And in Lingala, he puts this as statements to find ways to say, we are here, Tozali, Eza, it is like this. So that in sense, trying to make sense of the city is not a privileged scholarly position, but something that many are engaged in. So the ending of the book is maybe slightly abstract, but really it's to try and bring to life something of Deleuze and Benjamin's hopefulness about the emergent nature of concepts, generating concepts. How can we generate new ideas? How do they emerge out of the physicality of the world and rise up, flashing into the sky as possible new constellations? So instead of informality, we might see some new term flashing up out of the observations that we make, many of them. And drawing on some of Walter Benjamin's precise observations about thinking across many different instances of comparison, and very much in relation to urban experiences. One quote I like there, ideas come to life only when extremes are gathered around them, assembled around them. So we're kind of invited to think across the great diversity of the urban world. So somewhere in the book this arrives. So philosophically, we find the singularity, which is not a specific place, but in these terms, the individual observation or intensity in the world, which sparks thought, the starting of the journey of a concept. And we find concepts which flash up in the specific conditions of their creation now, here, but which exist also as multiplicities in close collaboration with many other constellations of observations. So my goal in this book has been trying to open up towards an analytics of the urban in which a multiplicity of surfaces and spatialities of interpretation, the urban now, reinforces the conclusion that building more globally relevant understandings of the urban will inspire conversations about urbanity amongst many different subjects of theorizing across the diversity of 21st century cities and their multiple histories, in a way as the many histories and experiences of Johannesburg were sort of painted onto this defunct power station. I can't remember what it's called, the tower there. So two quotes then from the conclusion: the global urban world, whatever the urban or urbanization might be, surely always has to remain open to the possibility of being different elsewhere. Strongly revisable concepts are key to the practice of global urban studies and to comparative urbanism. So here, the rich, diverse, inexhaustible urban world, and that's Lefebvrean in Impressable urban world, is our inspiration. This world incites our analysis, leaving always residuals and resistances, things we don't understand, rumbling intensities of the material world, exceeding whatever we think. So there we are. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jenny, for these very dense and thought-provoking presentations. I guess everybody is now keen to read the book if they have not read it yet. So I remember that probably Breeze have sent you the flyer for buying the book in case you wanted to buy with a discount. So just in case, take this opportunity.
Or if people are struggling with access or funds, then just email me. I can send you an electronic copy.
Okay, that's a big offer, of course. So I would start with Julie, if Tauri is okay with that, and then we move to Tauri, and then Jenny, and then we open up the discussion to everybody. So Julie, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm always happy to have a chance to talk with Jenny, and very also happy to be able to kind of say something about her book, which I really did kind of gobble up when it came out, because it reflects so many years of work and kind of brought together all of these different things that she's written over the years, but under a frame that I found so satisfying. So Jenny's work over these last, I don't know, since Ordinary Cities, so many years, has really inspired, I think, a lot of us, a lot of urban researchers who've been grappling with elsewhere, wherever that elsewhere is, and for us concerned about the ongoing epistemological debates about power and theory and voice in urban theory, and also, you know, the kind of post-colonial critiques of parochialism in our field. Her critical voice really resonated with so many of us who'd done the reading, who are in some field somewhere, and found that something was somehow lacking. So I actually personally didn't start with Ordinary Cities, but I started with Jenny's Eiger article, Cities in a World of Cities, a Comparative Gesture. And then from there, I read backwards and I read forwards through her kind of canon of writing, and found that her work raised so many questions for doing comparative work. It raised questions about starting points, site selection, topics for comparison, the conditions for comparability, as it pertained to all kinds of presumed knowledges, what we thought we knew, right, about political systems, economic conditions, scales, histories. And it, for me, like broke down the conventions of doing comparative work to also really practical questions. How do I write relationally or comparatively? Do I have separate chapters on these different cities? In my book that Jenny mentioned about art spaces in Beijing and Berlin, I was constantly asking myself, where do I write context? Where does this fit into this comparative approach, or this way that I want to compare and think about these places together? Have I adequately provided the reader the information that's necessary to even understand the research, right? So all of these questions I was asking myself, and I also struggled with the calling to start anywhere. So anywhere is also in this book, to start anywhere, because in the moment I had to defend my selection of comparative sites for my research funding, it could not be just anywhere, it had to be somewhere, right? I had to defend why I was looking at these two cities of all the cities in the world. And yet I thought, you know, if I just sit with this a little bit longer, if I sit with this and think about it a bit harder, there is a justification, but it's just not a conventional one. So Jenny's work has really inspired me to question all of this, about how, you know, when I design my research, how do I make all of these decisions? And as she just said previously, the desire to rethink what we think we know, and the kind of questioning of convention. This is obviously wonderful. It is also really exhausting. It is also very generative. So it's all of these things, I think, together. And for me, the Comparative Urbanism, the book that we're talking, structures all of these questions, the propositions, the possibilities in a powerful way. So it justifies the theoretical value of comparative urbanism in relation to other theories and debates about theorizing the urban. It lays out all of these inheritances, so whether that's methodological, theoretical, or otherwise, that really necessitate a reformatting of comparativism. And as Jenny just summarized, it really comprehensively answers that question of how to do the comparative work, with an entire palette of tactics and possibilities, opening up ways to think about conceptualization that are less definitive and more explorative. So it provides a language for urban theory and conceptualization, or maybe more actively the conceptualizing, that is expansive rather than declarative. So about all the things that the urban could be rather than what the urban is definitively. And I think maybe as a longtime reader of Jenny's work, something I really appreciated about the book, maybe that's additional to all the many journal articles these last years, is it's very clearly laid out intentions that comparative urbanism is not just a method. It's not just a method, it's really a way for urban scholars to transform urban studies. So at the same time that she pulls down theory from the pedestal, and to quote, displacing the overweening theories. I had to look up overweening. I love that adjective, though. They kind of humble the chest pounding, to humble the kind of posturing or privilege of thinking and speaking in the language of theory. She also argues for this idea of revisability with research that's conducted in a, quote, modest authorial voice. unquote. So this kind of duality of grand ambition, so nothing short of transforming urban studies, and also modesty. So transforming urban studies with a method based on a willingness maybe to learn, a willingness to generate something that's not final, but that's revisable. This is something I find deeply inspiring as an overall message of the book. But if ordinary cities led to all these questions about how to operationalize, how to do, I think comparative urbanism might also raise further questions. And in this case, maybe questions about the who, the subjects of doing research. So who now undertakes this work? What are the qualifications that are necessary, linguistic or otherwise? What are the resources that are required, financial or time? What are the institutional arrangements that would make it possible for more scholars to overthrow urban studies as we know it, and instead kind of engage in this, creative, explorative, generative endeavor? So kind of thinking, alongside the researchers' curiosity, her concerns and practices, that's kind of at the base of the section in the book that's about the generative grounds for comparison. There's also the researcher's abilities, her resources and privileges. And the conclusion really stresses the need for institutional transformation that supports the ability for any scholar anywhere to revise theory. So I think I have a few questions that's linked to this about, what are then the blockages or barriers for scholars to participate in this? And one is maybe about this question of recognition and acknowledgement. So quoting Jenny, she asks, what are the conventions which impede both the production and the acknowledgement of inventive concepts from certain scholars or places, unquote. In a paper that I have in the Journal of Urban Affairs about kind of a review of research that's been done about segregation in urban China, I kind of was asking this question of recognition throughout. So this is a huge body of research and scholarship about segregation, urban inequality, spatial fragmentation. They're revising concepts constantly, right? This is, when I read this work, I think of it as deeply theoretical. But I wonder, is it why it's not recognized, let's say, as such, why it's recognized instead more as applied research, as case studies. And so the question would be, what would it take to acknowledge and recognize these kinds of inventive concepts from scholars elsewhere? A second question maybe around this issue of who is doing this work is about the scholar herself. So again, quoting Jenny, while much has changed in the field theoretically, institutional transformation remains weak. The risk is that it is Northern scholars who once again are the ones undertaking research across the urban world and defining anew the terms of now a global urban studies. And in these moments, I'm always a little bit uncertain how much I want to identify myself as a Northern urban scholar. I think I often have affinity much more to what Patricia Hill Collins calls the outsider within, but I'm really welcome the call to decenter myself. But decentering myself, I'm immediately also asking, do I place the burden of fixing this issue, of fixing urban scholarship, of broadening it, creating, making it more global on the shoulders of scholars from the so-called South? So by decentering myself, who is now bearing the labor? Who has to now do the work of making urban studies more global and less parochial? Quoting Jenny again, I feel that some of us, she writes, need to write much less and dedicate our energies to the infrastructural and institutional transformations that are necessary for opening urban studies. And so what does that mean, I wonder? How do we support opening at that institutional level? I recalled I did my PhD at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and many, many years ago at the geography department there used to be a foreign language requirement in the geography when you do a geography degree, because the assumption was that geographers go and study elsewhere. They go and research some kind of elsewheres. And this was dropped, of course, years ago within the shadow of Anglo domination in the academy. But just thinking about like, what are the institutional possibilities to support this kind of work, to support more comparative research, to increase the capacities of more kinds of scholars to participate in this? And part of that is just reflecting on my own position in my own comparative research, the things that are necessary for me to do that work, whether that's language, passports, visas, resources, time, and so forth. There seem to be a lot of preconditions to compare that are very basic structural ones. So the invitation to explore, to stress modesty and revisability, the prerequisite of curiosity to transform urban studies are all, I find, very motivating, especially kind of rooted in this feminist post-colonial critique. But I wonder, how is this invitation to compare being distributed? Who is able to compare and under what conditions? So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Julie. Quite a further step to operationalization in a more power complex structure of institutions, agency, and actors involved in all this game. I would give now the floor to Tauri, and then Jenny will first answer, and then we open up. Tauri, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and many thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be here and to discuss the book. I know Jenny's work also for quite a while now, and of course the Ordinary Cities was an inspiration for me as well to actually delve deeper into studies of post-socialism. It was, before reading that, I was ready to get rid of that notion and not to work on that at all, and to avoid sort of regional studies. But I think the book was really empowering and inspirational. And I was also glad to see in that book, actually now, the post-socialism having a much more prominent position than in Ordinary Cities. I think it was about 3-4 places it was mentioned in the previous book, and now it enters in the narrative as well, not just as a side note, but I think also as a quite important part of the argument. And also, I mean, thinking alongside of post-socialism here, I mean, it came up as part of a region, as compared to Global South. And in that moment, I was thinking, perhaps the way I would see post-socialism is actually more in the lines of Global South, if you think about in the section of chapter 1. And I think there's an alternative notion which advanced by Martin Müller, for instance, the Global East, which for a little bit, I still feel, is the same as post-socialism, doesn't avoid some of the problems perhaps as well. But it could be, if it works more in this kind of, as you set out the notion of Global South in that chapter 1. So perhaps there's a way to advance here in these ways of thinking about post-socialism as well. And we talked a little bit about language here as well, and now I'm working in an Estonian community. Of course, I need to be more engaged with the local site as well, and publishing media, and etc. Also in terms of how to speak English, how to write English, right? There's always some mistakes, I guess, and I know this kind of problems with finding right articles and prepositions, and which is something very unnatural from my language. And I guess maybe if the comparative urbanism seeks an openness, it's also about acceptance of different qualities of English, which still should be legible, of course, but I guess it might also relate to the way the English is spoken and the English is written. This is just one of the thoughts. And in relation to this kind of different languages emerging in, or the question about how much scholars should work or know different languages, and should there be another prominent languages in the field, such as German, such as Spanish, such as perhaps French as well, Chinese. And alongside English, coming from a small language community, it's always this question of, if there's a multiple centers, how to manage that? Can you actually speak all the different languages? Estonia has 1 million speakers, so in a way, having English as the lingua franca is kind of advantage if I don't have to speak 4 different languages. But in a way, I think this kind of call for openness is definitely important. But about the book, I think it's a wonderful integrative analysis of comparison. It's really drawing together existing scholarship, and it really sets out the agenda that Jenny has been advancing for 2 decades, I would say now, in a truly forceful manner. And I would expect the book really to be at the center for many comparative works as well, and taking these kind of insights into more empirical studies as well. So it's an invitation for open, flexible, and emergent comparative analysis. And also the real strength of the book is its synthesis. And it brings together a lot of different works, and also something that might not have been seen as so combinable in many writings before. I also like the combinations of Marxian and Deleuzian analysis. I remember in my times of PhD that they might not have been as easily combinable, and also some of the SDS, Latour type of studies, and more Foucauldian, more Marxian studies. And I think that really naturally come together in the book now. Jenny shifts from one to another very easily. And also in the way of like the notion of context, which I know Brenner also uses, and which seems very problematic looking from actual network perspective. And really in this writing in this book, it really seems quite nicely understandable. So it doesn't become something as problematic as it might seem. And also the ways it brings together planetary urbanization with comparative urbanism. Sometimes there is also some contradictions or divergences there, or conflicts, but I think this book also nicely sees the comparative urbanism as an agenda that definitely incorporates or engages with planetary urbanization as well. Of course, the book is not a guide, so there's not a framework of how to do a comparative urbanism now. It doesn't, there's no go through these steps and then you have done it. And so it's more like up to a researcher to actually work through that and to find a way of how to implement or how to do in practice a comparative research. So of course the book highlights the comparison as doing, as emerging in practice. So it's not just an empirical exercise, but it's also conceptual and perhaps even a philosophical exercise. So, and I also like very much the stress that comparison doesn't mean having reaching ground from the start, but the grounds shift in the practice, right? That's usually our understanding, that in order to compare, let's have a clarity on what are the definitions of all the terms, and then we just go and do the comparison. And I think if you do the comparison in practice, that's the way you tend to start, right? But I think the book and the whole work of comparative urbanism has been an invitation to not do it in that way, to leave the conceptualization more open, actually. And so the comparison emerges in the book through words that important to learn order from others, and doing so offers comparison as something which is slow moves, a deep sense of the precarity and revisability of concepts, to quote from the book, and also the notion of abbreviations, which is from Lefebvre. I think is a nice way to think about concepts as abbreviations, and yeah, looser openings for learning. Looser openings of learning, and this kind of language, which is very empowering and opening the kind of feeling of what the comparison should be. Also, attention to micro or fragments, which are tied to macro and wider political references, and I think that's a very powerful. So it's a very concrete, very local, very specific, very minuscule aspects, such as the fire carrier art piece and the way it is set in the urban site, and the whole complexity around that and how it actually shows the comparative potential of such analysis. So looking into something very minor and small and trying to find ways of conceptualizing in a much broader sense. And also the question about language. I mean, getting to some of the questions now as well. I think language is always at the very center in that work. I guess in many of the geography work as well. I think British geography has a tendency to focus on the way something is said and really finding the right way of saying something and developing and dealing with the way of expressing. And but I think the question about naming and how the names work in practice, so the names such as names of the concepts, right, are not simply analytical terms, but they are something that work in the practice as well, as Jenny notes and refers to, for instance, in the sense of global cities, right, which is a theoretical concept which is then put into practice with some negative possibilities. And I just wonder, what if, or can we do a reimagining of cities through language as well? Or can we sort of, if you think that language we can use concepts in a negative way, can we use them as a way of building different kinds of cities, or more empowering way as well? I mean, could we think in these ways about language and the way we name concepts, or the way the concepts sort of become part of the practice of urban life as well? And the second point, so it is about vernacular language as well. The concepts, maybe borrowed from vernacular language, but also going back to vernacular language and what they do there. And then can we imagine urban studies work or comparative urbanist work in this ways as well? And the second point is more about the sort of practical research projects. And I mean, I'm still struggling with explaining to, especially to think about practitioners, right? And the case I work with is Tallinn in Estonia. And when I need to explain to foreign international projects, so what can you learn from Tallinn? What kind of lessons can we tell you about urban transport here? We can tell about free transport, that's great, but there's still a limited set of things I can offer in that sense, or maybe I haven't imagined that enough. But the local practitioners here, of course, go and look into Copenhagen and German cities and find inspiration. So I think there's still, if you look at this kind of on the ground use of comparison, I think there's a very strong divide still. And what is the place to learn and what is the place that goes to learn? And I think and I don't see yet it being shifted around. That, I don't know, London planners coming all to Tallinn or elsewhere in Eastern Europe, or going to somewhere else, I don't know, Johannesburg perhaps to learn. And so I don't know if you have now you have done also some, the ERC project and other projects, I don't know if you have some experiences on that in the practice as well, how this has happened. So, but many thanks. I mean, it's a wonderful book, and I'm looking forward for the following discussion as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tauri. Thanks a lot, both of you, actually, for your comments. The issue of language seems to be prominent. Actually, here I might say something about IJUR. IJUR is the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, where many of the present people participated and published, and etc. And it has an explicit language policy which tries to go beyond English-centered. So the quality of the language is not the main criteria to be selected as a published paper. And actually, they are even proposing and supporting if the language is a bit weaker, but if the paper is substantive in terms of content theory, empirics, etc. So this should not be a barrier, at least not in IJUR. Other journals are a bit more picky on that, but IJUR is definitely a very open-minded and supportive journal. Jenny, so if you want to react to these insights, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Well, I would just say thank you so much, both of you. Those are really very welcome comments and questions, and I think chart directions which I hope we will travel in together. certainly the journey to here has been one that each of you, Tauri and Julie, have contributed to for me. So you've both been a strong personal inspiration. Tauri on post-socialism and comparison, and the lovely paper he wrote while he was at UCL on that. So I guess just a few responses. One is the pragmatics of designing comparisons. So Julie, you mentioned it's all very well, so you can start anywhere, but actually we only ever start somewhere specific. And I think that's a good, it's a good caution around the sort of creative, generative, comparative imagination that I'm postulating in the book, because I think very often if you're doing a PhD or you're applying for a specific research grant, you do have to be cautious. So you can't just say, oh, I'm just going to start a conversation between these two places. Some people can pull that off. So Sean Teo, for example, who's published a bit on comparative conversations, he did spend his PhD between London and Shenzhen and come up with something. It's really difficult to frame, and he worked really hard to achieve that. But I think mostly for PhD, something clear, contained, somewhat predetermined can be very helpful. And for research grants, it's the lowest common denominator. So who's the person who's going to say, oh, but these are very different kinds of cities, you know, one is much bigger than the other, one is much poorer than the other. And that's quite difficult to contest in, say, a European competition. But I'm really hopeful that as we've produced so many great examples by now of different ways of doing comparison, this becomes the orthodoxy. And I'm fairly confident that we're heading in that direction. And Tauri, you make the point, which became very clear to me as I was doing my own comparisons and also reading everybody else's work, that the grounds of the comparison shift. You know, so you start perhaps in one place thinking you're comparing, you know, say governance in two different cities. And actually it could be that as the comparison emerges, you're really thinking in a more precise way about the object is defined very differently. And that is a very important characteristic of the practice of comparison. So I think there are some cautions here about how people might seek to operationalize creative comparison. Sometimes you have to present a sort of front of being very formal and proper, or be more contained and hope the creativity comes through a bit later. Julie, your comments about the recognition, and I haven't read your Urban Affairs article. I will read that eagerly as soon as possible. So who sees the creative work that people are doing, and what is the institutional labor that we all are, I think, called upon to do now, which is to do much more of the kind of thing Yuri was talking about with the journals that claim to be international, but are actually really propagating a northern intellectual agenda, defining internationally excellent in our name. And this is not excellent global urban work, which comes in many different forms, languages, styles, and so on. So a lot more work needs to be done for journals to accept very different kinds of publications. And here, a great paper by Sue Parnell and Edgar Peterson in IJER 2016 made the point that if urban studies doesn't change, then, well, Africa must just be left out of that. And I think a lot of that is about what gets published, what kind of work is published. And I think also, this is not to say that people are not busy conceptualizing all over the place. So, you know, scholars across Africa, senior scholars have done so much creative work, have a wonderful understanding of their context. But who often publishes that work are the young PhD students trotting about the world, doing some study, getting advice from people, building up understandings. And I think a lot more of the work that urban studies could do should be collaborative, collective, should recognize that labor, that input, those insights. So we need a lot more robust and sophisticated ways of reviewing work, which insists on naming the sources of authority and inspiration. So many, many things to do. And I think, Julie, I'm glad you read out that. I think it's the last sentence of my book. I think the burden of our labor needs to shift from, you know, our sort of career progression demands and trying to meet all these journal requirements to really trying to transform the conditions of production of our discipline. I completely agree with that. And I hope we have a lot more comments about that to come. So Tauri, yes, the more prominent place for post-socialism in comparative urbanism is partly down to you. So thank you for that. And also the emerging and wonderful work of many scholars in that region. You point out at the end that the power relations associated with learning from different places it remains of big concern. So who will come to learn from Tallinn? Very important question. And what places might an authoritative center of, say, urban policy or global power relations like London learn from? And I think so there's two different questions. There's, can London learn from many places, and can we compose and create inventive work and collaborations with people in different contexts to generate a knowledge in which London is de-exceptionalized, is placed on a par with everywhere else, and can look rather ridiculous in comparison? Yes, we can do that. Question two, can we convince any London policymakers, given the power relations of development in London, to believe us? Probably not. But the first part of that, I think, is really great when you get started with that question. So the comparison that Phil Harrison, Philong Wu, and I did of Joburg, London, Shanghai, and we have a couple of papers out about that. It sees the way in which London finances its development is so counterproductive, so destructive of the built environment here, so narrow and happenstance. And the specific design of municipal financing in South Africa, which blends property tax with rates and services tax, and looks at beneficiation anywhere in the city as something that can enhance the revenues of the metropolitan government, that generates a very open and strategic approach to urban development. Whereas in London, you have to fund each development from the planning gain of that development, which just means you push up higher and higher, more ridiculous buildings. So in fact, the insight that we brought from Johannesburg then about that spatiality of financing, and that we brought from China, which was about the role of the state in development. The state is everything in development: the planner, the regulator, the developer, the investor, etc. In London, it made us look at what the state is doing in its different roles. And there we see that rather than the greedy global developer or financialization, actually what's driving the horrible form of so many developments in London is the state. So in that sense, we saw a moment, and I see it enacted in many of the things I'm looking at here, where London can really learn from different places. And there's several studies that have gone in that direction. So Yimin Zhao has been part of a study with Hyun Shin, look at China, Malaysia, and London, and many others have done such comparisons. So I'm quite eager that we would bring that together and perhaps pose some learning from many different places, for example. So I think probably that's enough, and maybe other things will come up from other questions. So thanks, Yuri.
Wonderful. Thank a lot for your first reactions. I hope everybody wrote down some questions to be asked now. Now the floor is open to everybody. So should you have some questions, comments on both the book and also the debate that is going on, please raise your hand and come forward. Don't be shy. That's precisely the forum where everybody can join the conversation. And we will be very happy to share this opportunity with everybody. So while we are waiting, maybe I ask a question. Otherwise, we waste a lot of input, but please raise your hand and don't worry about anything. There is one question in the chat box. I see. You can also use the chat box eventually. So I read it loud so that everybody, and also the recording, has it. You, in brackets Jennifer Robinson, mentioned that opportunities for generating new concepts can be found when we, as researchers, are not able to explain how existing concepts describing the urban world are connected. Which works of Gilles Deleuze and Walter Benjamin are you referring to? You're muted, Jen.
Yeah, sure. So I think, yes, I'm hoping that we might generate concepts of urban experiences, not only when existing concepts fail us, but because we are in contexts where those concepts are emergent and they're problematics that are there, but may be able to be part of wider conversations if we had a more respectful form of communication in global urban studies. So I'm thinking at the moment, teaching a course with Phil Harrison again and a number of colleagues at WITS, and we're looking with the students at a very South African process which we call displaced urbanization, which came up under apartheid. That is, Black people were pushed out of cities and forced to live in so-called homelands, Bantustans, and had to commute then to centers nearby to get employment. So this was an urbanization which was displaced by apartheid segregation. However, in a post-apartheid world, many Bantustans have become places where people can access land and entitlements, and have seen the explosion of urbanization, even in very remote places. So displaced urbanization in a very dynamic sense, that is, people are producing new forms of urbanism, with which colleagues at the Gauteng City Region Observatory and Nyaka Mosiane and Graham Gotts have developed an understanding as displaced urbanism. So we have an emergent formation of urbanization in very dispersed and far-flung places. And this is also a form of urbanization in many parts of the world, urbanization along infrastructure corridors, linked to new kinds of developments here and there. And we have some great scholarship on this formation in South Africa. So opening up a conversation, talking to people who are thinking about similar processes in different contexts becomes a possibility. So it's not just that we have to wait for some concept we're very familiar with to fail us, but that we can look to our emergent concepts. And in terms of Deleuze and Benjamin, I mentioned the Difference in Repetition book, which really sets out a drama, a complex philosophical account of basically how a subject encounters observations and phenomena, and how in various ways then they transformed and brought into formation as some kind of conceptualization, but always there's a multiplicity of possibilities there. So this is a very complex argument, but it replaces some earlier philosophical accounts of concepts as, say, famously representations or mirroring of reality and their failure and so on. So it's a very different formation of how concepts might be formed. I found that appealing for multiplying what we're doing. And in Walter Benjamin, the most inspiring part of his work that I enjoyed in this regard is what is called a prolegomena or something to the on tragic drama German Trauerspiel, and it's his habilitation dissertation, which in fact was failed by German universities, and it's a magnificent account of how you work patiently across what is actually an extinct form. It was not existing and there was little record of it, patiently to construct the many different formations and experiences of this form of Baroque tragic drama, and to design and define a concept on that basis. And this is where his idea about constellations arises, in this very theoretical but deeply empirical historical project. And he loosely lines that up with his work in the Arcades project and his attempt to think about Paris, capital of the 19th century, and so on. So for me, it was such an inspiring connection, and Deleuze and Benjamin also come together in some analyses of the Baroque and philosophies around that time. So there's, yeah, I found it very inspiring, but actually one should perhaps be turning to other contexts and writers and thinkers for inspiration. This is a formulation that I found interesting, and I'd be really intrigued by other people's sources of inspiration for theorizing revisable concepts and so on. Thanks.
Okay. We have already a few more questions actually in the chat box. So one is by Lisa. How important is comparative urbanism in urban governance? And then we have Monica de France, who will ask the question probably orally.
Okay, does Monica want to ask a question, and then we can...
You can group them, yes, in your answer. Perfect. Monica, please.
Hello, do you hear me, see me? Hello. Hello, hi, Jenny. I met you, I think, many years ago in London in your workshop when I was at LSE. And I have been a professor in Vienna and now senior research fellow. I appreciate very much your work on the ordinary city and on comparative urbanism, certainly, as I also take a qualitative approach to culture. But I come also from political science, and I would be interested because I was always like, in my education, I studied a lot about comparative politics, and there is a lot of methodological debates about how to do comparisons in social sciences, in comparative politics, which also, I don't think that they are very nationalist that they are dominated by methodological nationalism. So, and I wonder whether, I think it's very important to criticize within urban studies the focus on cities and on global cities and the power relations, which was basically the case within urban studies, that there was a very poor comparative awareness and method. But would it not be worth, or did you do that, to look out to the existing debates within the social sciences, within the other disciplines, which have a very elaborated approach to comparative research? Did you look at these debates, and how do you contribute, or is it really, do we need a separate debate on this in urban studies?
Thanks, Monica. Shall I jump in? Yeah, I think, I mean, in urban studies, certainly the comparative urban politics has been a very important contributor. So thinking about urban governance in urban studies has been really important, but it's also been conducted quite often in this kind of narrow formal way. So what cities can we compare? Are they in the same kind of polities? Are they in democracies? Are they having the same kind of level of economic development? What kind of government do they have? Then we start to compare places that have got mayors and places that don't, because it's a bit narrow, or comparing within a certain narrow range of actors. So we think about how cities are governed across many countries. This includes traditional authorities, mafia, gangs, occupying and selling land, highly bottom-up processes of occupation and formulation of development. So governance is very diverse, and the actors are very diverse across the urban world. And this is where I think bringing in a very loose basis for comparison, which could be, so for us in our work, we took the large-scale urban development project, and so the Shanghai, London, Joburg case I told you about, but we also now have a much larger project with colleagues in Ghana, Professor George Wusu, in Dar es Salaam, Professor Wilbert Kombe, in Malawi, Evans Matunga, and with Phil Harrison and others working alongside us. We're looking again at large-scale development projects which open to all possible kinds of urban political formations which need to be theorized, thought about in relation to urban development politics. Not enough just to say, oh, we wildly stretch ourselves from the US to the EU. So really to explode our analysis of urban governance. And I guess that also speaks to your question about, can we learn from the debates in the wider comparative politics literature, Monica? And I think you're quite right. There have been a lot of creative efforts in different disciplines. And I did, in one draft of the book, I did create a chapter which looked at those and through different disciplines. But it's hard to be robust, and they all go off in different directions with their questions and formulations and long histories, and topologies, especially very difficult to get around what can be sometimes quite obscure debates in comparative methods. So I abandoned that, but with Patrick Legales, we finished, and it's being at the moment in press, Handbook of Comparative Urban Studies, which has contributors from all these different kinds of disciplinary areas within urban studies, which which precisely explore those questions. So, for example, in relation to comparative political science. So I found it beyond me to be able to do that convincingly, but with a panoply of wonderful people in the handbook, this will help. So, thanks.
I was just wondering whether it's sometimes better not to invent things to begin from scratch, but because a lot of things are there already, and they are also often very formalized, not necessarily talking about government or governance, but about concepts and a case study. There is a lot of literature on case study research, actually.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Thanks. I agree.
We have 2 more questions in the chat box, so I will read them out. Odessa asks, for young scholars just starting their master's research, how do you balance familiarizing yourself with the established literary canon versus engaging lesser known, but perhaps relevant, non-peer-reviewed publications and writers from the global south, in brackets, or from outside academia? So how to build them into their own analytical framework and strategy for research? That's the first question. And the second question comes from Katie Friedman. How can a comparative approach contribute to efforts to deconstruct structural and systemic racism, particularly in post-colonial contexts? Has there been any scholarship that has attempted to address this?
Yeah, so two tiny questions.
Yeah.
So I think the first one is obviously quite tricky, and I guess it depends on who's marking your essays. But what we've done at UCL, we started a new master's program which specifically tries to teach through the creative scholarship and experiences of Johannesburg as one example. And we also include other contexts in our preparation, and hoping that in future we'll discuss and learn from scholars in other places and build a collaborative learning situation. So we have a collaboration with WITS to develop our program. And the whole idea is that that scholarship and those insights are valorized. So one strategy could be to take the phenomenon, so to perhaps take an empirical leap. Maybe the canon you're reading or the lectures that are being given direct you towards certain kinds of phenomena and objects. But if you think about it from a specific place and learn from the scholarship on that place, would you come to that question in a really different sense? So like I was saying, displaced urbanization in South Africa is a deep colonial and historical experience. It's, it's not even just apartheid, it's 100 years old or more. And it asks different kinds of questions of things that we receive as our wisdom. So for example, the idea that there are some things that could be outside of the urban and we shouldn't include them in defining the urban. For people in sub-Saharan Africa, that's a very deeply politicized question. And the political demand has been that everything that's in the urban, everyone who lives in the urban is urban. And it's so important politically to claim that, because people have been pushed out and not allowed to be urban. At the same time, these places of displacement are also sites of constituting urban cultures, even in so-called rural areas. There's much more complex spatiality around that critique, as there is also more complex spatiality and set of processes defining whatever we think planetary urbanization might be. So my colleagues at WITS made the provocation, is displaced urbanization, planetary urbanization South African style? Well, I would suggest we start with our own concepts alongside, learning from those ones, but they could point us towards sites where we could offer something else. And for those of us who are not subject to somebody marking our work, we can, just be more demanding about coming up with new terms. And then the second one, how can a comparative approach contribute to efforts to deconstruct structural and systemic racism? Well, I would say the deconstruction that I'm hoping comparative urbanism might be doing is within our own world of urban studies and That is, we have our own racism and systemic exclusions of whose voice counts, whose work counts, whose experiences count. And I think the demand for not just thinking from elsewhere, but the multiplicity of conceptualizations that might be emergent with an open reconstruction of the comparative imagination. This, for me, is about transforming ourselves. And I think the contribution to deconstruct racism in different contexts would be perhaps the politics of our choices we make, our alignments, our collaborations, our where our energies are put, and solidarities, and also supporting scholars in the way that Julie was suggesting is something that our institutions don't do very well, is supporting the emergence of analyses and conceptualizations and so on, which would oppose racism and oppose power relations in those contexts. And I guess the final point is that in putting a finger on who is doing the work, you know, me, white South African woman of a certain generation who's now spent decades in London academy circles, what does it mean for me to be speaking these things? What are my political alignments, histories, and so on? These are never so straightforward, but I think the putting a finger on who composes comparisons, who is speaking, whose voice, whose trajectories, journeys, affinities. I think comparativism can, in that sense, thinking about the method, can help to identify that. But I'm sure that, Katie, you have many other ideas, so please feel free to come in.
Do you mean, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering that question. I think I was thinking, the context that I come from is working within the Chicago metropolitan region in the United States, and recognizing that the United States has had hundreds of years worth of structural and systemic racism that has affected different communities in different ways, but in a way that, like, governments today aren't even aware that the legacies of those systems still exist, even though they're still impacting the people that live there. And maybe there's a way to kind of comparatively look at how the same system has affected places in different ways, so that people can come together to think about how to meaningfully dismantle some of those structures. It's work that I know is beginning with some academics in the Chicago region, but it's still a big question mark. So, and I'm sure we can learn from elsewhere in the world as well.
Yeah, I think that's superb, you know, and I think scholars who've been, you know, for whom racism has been their main struggle, and analyses of urban contexts which have been racialized and continue to be so in different ways. Certainly the US is, I've always, you know, and until recently, I think the urban studies scholarship on US cities has been remarkably remiss in addressing racialization. So, you know, much as I love a lot of the work on neoliberalization, I think it includes the key lines of power relations and exclusion which come along with racialization, and which, how can you talk about neoliberalization in the US city without that? So someone who did some early and interesting work on that, David Wilson from Urbana, Illinois, Champaign or somewhere, he did think about that, those processes. And recently a wonderful paper by Anna Brand in Society and Space looks at the reconstruction of New Orleans and sees this as a process of entrenched racial exclusion rather than sort of neoliberalized privatization of development there. So I think that's a very overdue agenda, and probably there's a lot to learn. So rather than, you know, inventing a new kind of analysis in the US and thinking this can be exported to the rest of the world, actually there's much to learn on analyses of racialized urban situations across the world. Yeah.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot, indeed. Quite an interesting development of debate. Maybe I ask now also a question, which actually I think becoming sensitive to comparisons in general has also a biographical element in it. So we have heard Jenny, South Africa, now London, experiencing different contexts, Julie as well, Tauri as well, and many of us are moving around the world and experiencing differences. And the comparison is probably something which prompts our mind to not to take things for granted, but to challenge them and to question the experience we are having by being in different contexts. And this kind of decontextualization or recontextualization brings me to the real question. So the role of context, it has been addressed in many, so both in Jenny's presentation, but also in the comments by the discussants, that context plays an important role in comparison. And my question would be, okay, so do we formalize the contextuality as an element of the analytical framework we are using in comparing, or do we leave it loose and become sensitive to the role of the context in constructing specific phenomena? You were mentioning the role of a state in China and in London, which is quite different, but it's still the role of a state, and it might have a very different magnitude. And maybe in Estonia, it had a different magnitude 50 years ago and now, which is undergoing quite a deep transformation, embracing new paradigms, etc. So if we elevate the, let's say, the conceptual and also the ambition of decontextualizing and recontextualizing, and we address, for instance, at a higher abstract level, the concept. So the state. The state is almost everywhere, even if it's a very lean and very light state. But it addresses several different functions. I don't know, the growth machine in the United States has a very different meaning than in Europe, etc., etc. So what is the role of contextuality in this kind of comparative analysis? Or how would you put forward a contextuality of all of that?
Yes, Yuri, that's a very thoughtful question. I guess I would make one short answer to the first set of comments you made around us, so we're inspired to do comparison because we're wondering about the globe. And I wonder, I would prefer not to see that as the persona that generates comparisons. Of course we do, and we are part of this still possible trajectory, but maybe it will come to an end. So there's lots of places we can't go. And who moves, who has got the money and resources to do that kind of thing. So, the baseline of what comparative imagination for me is reading respectfully and engaging with scholars from different contexts in different ways. So, and of course, that's also mediated by whose work has come to visibility. Maybe also we need to read much more grey literature, much more regionally located journals, so a lot more work to open up the trajectory to become a different kind of thing, about a collaboration. So the work with Fulong in Shanghai began when he just marched up to me and said, we should compare China and Africa. Like, wow, okay. I don't know anything about China. This is really a collaborative, you can't do those things, traveling around the world. It has to be composed differently from the learning by reading and the actual respectful collaborations with people. So that's just sort of to riff off that a little bit. And then the second thing is the context question is a really important one. So what can the context do in comparison? It kind of depends, as I was suggesting, on your theory of the urban. So what is context for different approaches? And in a sort of global sense of place, Massey kind of way, and what Jill Hart picked up on her relational comparisons, places, contexts are where many things come together. They simultaneous, they interact, and they form this emergent place. or hybridize wider processes, according to others. So what role can context play would depend a little bit on that. So if you're a sort of Brenner Peck and Theodore neoliberalization person, you believe in variegation, then context will help you to define the transformation of the wider process at the same time as that wider process transforming the context. So what is the point of doing comparisons is to try and understand how that is working out, that variegation. It could be that context help you to see the process. So I think Manuel Albers has an essay in our comparative handbook where he's very insistent that it's the financialized process that we want to understand. And so each context helps us to understand that better. But I think for many people, the context exists only because you're implying there's something else. There's a wider process, there's an abstraction. But if we were to think of the urban world in a more Lefebvrean vein as this fullness of produced place, each one specific and distinctive, we might cut through that in a different way than thinking about a context produced by something that's beyond it. We might start to produce understandings differently. Or as Tauri talks about, if we're having a more assemblage theory or actor network theory, we might, we would dissipate context altogether and be looking at more specific entities. So that really depends, on how you think that term. And I don't know, on the state, I mean, that's a complicated question, and one that I'm really interested in at the moment, because the state is a proposition that seems to be emergent from society in a, sort of Bob Jessup kind of way. And somehow things always seem to yield the answer state, even though it's all complex and so on. And in many places, the state is not a state in any formal sense, but an emergent configuration of lines of power and resource flows, which are about many things: consolidating party power, consolidating personal enrichment, yielding lines of influence. So it's not clear to me that things add up to stateness. So it's a big question. What is the politics? I don't think we can even say the state is a generalized phenomenon. I think we have to widen that question if we to think about many urban contexts, in which case a comparative imagination in which we're aware that other places might be very different could be helpful.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree with you. Thanks a lot. We have one last question maybe, and then we can close the session. So, hello, thanks a lot for your presentation and for the discussion by Fedor Bezelov. I'm wondering about appropriate methods of social research within this framework, like qualitative or quantitative prolonged ethnographies or data analysis. How can we change our instruments by using comparative urbanism? Sorry, I can't ask the question in voice.
Thanks, Yuri. You read very well. It's nice. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Are there methodological implications? I think one thing that I quite like about the handbook that Patrick and I have drawn together is that many different methodologies in social science research can be configured to inspire comparative analyses in different ways, from very formal quantitative data to deeply ethnographic or experiential studies. So, but each of these would present different kind of problematics about how you are able to talk across more than one phenomenon, or to link deeply specific forms of experience shaped by certain cultures of emotions and so on to others. That would be very complicated. Also, I think one of the aspects of one of the projects I was involved in was that we worked very closely with community-based organizations. And in fact, the knowledge, the London, Shanghai, Joburg case was very much generated through practice, through engagement, through being part of the organization, supporting, learning with and alongside them. So in that sense, that may seem very embedded. But some of the very interesting conversations that came through that project were about the two different organizations. We didn't link to anybody in China for various reasons, but perhaps misguidedly so. But in Johannesburg and London, the two different community organizations were able to find very great value in conversations about the way in which they pulled together people across different locations in the city, different groups, identities, incomes, etc., and how to frame organization into a metropolitan space from very specific struggles, for example. So these conversations are very emergent. So that kind of committed, engaged research, which is sometimes doesn't necessarily get valued so much in the academy or lead to high-flowing accounts, can be, really generative of conversations and supportive of people who are struggling in difficult political contexts. So I think I would say it's very wide open, but your, sort of creativity is required. And also coming back to Monica's point is that disciplines have a whole lot of different possibilities which are embedded in their histories and embedded in their methods, and to use these productively, but also maybe question them. So that's some rather general points, but I think that was a good question.
Okay, thanks really a lot. Thanks to everybody actually for the inspiring presentation, the comments and the questions. I think the debate evolved very nicely. So we can close here the session. I would like also to invite you to the next book presentation and discussion with Matthias Brandt, who by the way was also here since the beginning. And the book will be the commodification gap, gentrification and public policy in London, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. And we have as discussants Justin Cady, who recently moved to University of Cambridge from Vienna, and Anna Jelnina from the University of Helsinki. The presentation will be on the 19th of April, same time. And if you want, you can register online and we will have a link sent to you. So thanks a lot to everybody and to Jenny in particular. And see you next time, I hope. And have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Yuri. Bye.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Julie and Tauri. That was great.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.